And now for our panel session for the day, which I think will promise to be a very interesting one. Again, just a reminder to panelists to please keep the camera and mic off unless you're speaking. First, I'm going to invite our panelists to one by one briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll move to a set of questions. So we'll start with Professor Anna-Lou Waller.
Hello, I'm Anna-Lou, and I'm a professor at the University of Dundee, working in assistive technology.
Thanks, Anna-Lou. Kate Lister.
Hi everybody, my name's Kate Lister. I'm a lecturer in inclusive education here at the Open University. My specialisms are in inclusion, disability and wellbeing, and particularly how we can embed inclusion in pedagogy and practice.
Welcome, Kate. Dr. Anne-Marie Houghton.
Hello, Farah, and good afternoon to everybody. Or almost good afternoon. I'm Anne-Marie and I work at Lancaster. I have 3 roles there. I'm the Dean for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. I work in our educational research department where I research in the area of inclusion and disability, amongst other things. And I also work with our educational development team. So like Kate, I'm very keen on ways in which we can embed well-being and inclusive and accessible, connecting up with Anna-Lou, approaches to the teaching and learning that we offer.
Nice meeting you, Anne-Marie. Thank you for joining us. If I could just remind everybody to please keep their cameras and mics off unless you're talking, that would be great. Thank you. And finally, Victoria Passant.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name's Victoria. I'm the Programme Manager of Youth Employment at Leonard Cheshire. Leonard Cheshire is one of the largest disability charities here in the UK, and we also work internationally. I lead all of our work that supports young people with the transition from education into work. So whether that's from secondary schools, colleges into university, or university into the world of work post-degree. The majority of my time is spent running and leading a graduate internship program called Change 100, which I'll talk about a little later, which again specifically supports people who are exiting university and higher education.
Welcome, Victoria. Thank you for joining us. So I'll now move to a set of questions. I'll pose the question and then ask each of the panelists in turn to respond and to keep their responses to under 2 minutes. And then if there's any time permitting, I'll ask for any additional comments. So this normally we would have been in a room and it would have flowed like a conversation, but we'll just have to sort of click ourselves on and off. So please bear with me through the pauses. But the first question for our panelists is, in your opinion, after a year of COVID-19 and the recent political and societal changes, where do you feel the sector is today with respect to disability and mental health? So I'll just start with, I'll change the order around a little bit, but I'll start with Anna-Lou.
You would give me the most difficult question. I think on one hand, we've seen the ability we have to level the field, but on the other hand, we've seen people with more severe disabilities being even more disadvantaged by COVID, and the inability of educators to support people's assistive technology when they are at a distance. So there's a lot more work to be done. I think the level playing field is in reach, but we've also got to think about those who need the additional physical support to actually access the technology as it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Kate?
Hi, Fiery, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting time to be working in disability and inclusion and mental wellbeing in higher education. I think COVID has obviously brought intense challenges, but at the same time, drawing on something that Annalou was saying this morning in her keynote, this is the first time we've really seen that inclusion and mental wellbeing and accessibility is on everybody's radar, and everybody's very close to being on the same page about it, which is really, really exciting. I've been working in this area a long time, and I remember way back when we started talking about embedding mental wellbeing in the curriculum and making sure that inclusion and accessibility were reflected throughout the studies, and building on some of Anne-Marie's amazing work in this area. A few years ago, it was almost unknown, and now suddenly it's really on everybody's radars. And so I think it's a fantastic time to be working in this area.
Thank you, Kate. Anne-Marie?
There we are. Thank you. I sadly wasn't able to hear Annalou this morning, but because I was teaching. However, I think, just to agree very much with Kate, I think the fact is that this is very much on the agenda now. And I think if it hadn't possibly been for COVID-19, we would have still been having some of the battles to help people to recognise the benefits and the importance of making some of the teaching and learning far more inclusive. Certainly at Lancaster, one of the things that we're talking about is very much this approach that now, what can we learn from the experience that we've had, and how can that be taken forward? I've been very heartened and encouraged by our students who've actually undertook a sort of study themselves to try and find out about ways in which they could improve and enhance the learning experience for themselves and for the future. And the fact that we've been able to work collaboratively about that, picking up on some of the challenges that Annalou raised, because of course we mustn't forget that they still exist. And there are still pockets of resistance, but in a sense there's a much greater groundswell, recognition and appreciation of the importance and the benefits and value for us all adopting these inclusive approaches, not only for disabled students, but for students who are facing other difficulties, notably perhaps those who are carers and care leavers, or estranged students, or students studying at a distance, topics I know that you've been covering earlier on in the week.
Thank you. And Victoria.
Thank you. Definitely the easiest the part going forth in the first question. Just to echo again some of the comments that the fellow panelists have made, I think the past year has been, although full of a lot of challenges through the work that I specifically do, which is not always necessarily directly with higher education, but a lot with employers and supporting people with that transition. So we do work closely with career services on campus and disability services. I think we've learned a huge amount the past year in terms of how we deliver our programmes and how to better support and to make our programmes more inclusive. I think for lots of the young people and candidates that we support through my programme, the past 12 months has kind of forced both employers and some of our university partners to think more creatively about how to deliver kind of good quality teaching and good quality internship and work experience placements, which probably wouldn't have happened at such pace if it wasn't for the pandemic over the past 12 months. And I think, as Annalou touched on, that has also kind of had some negative effects for some of the people that we support through our programs as well, that have found it harder to get assistive technology, to especially access internship and work experience opportunities post-university. So some interesting areas there. I think, as Kate mentioned, the commitment to diversity, inclusion and belonging has really come to the forefront of the agenda, which is really great to see. And that will, I think, as we've talked about, bring benefits to not just disabled graduates and students, but to everybody. I think one of the challenges, which I know we'll come on to talk about next, is how do you translate that into real tangible action, not just kind of a spoken commitment to that kind of work as well. And particularly for my area of work, has had a significant impact on the job market, as I'm sure you're all aware. So I think for us, it's definitely something we've learned the past year, kind of how to better support young people and graduates with the transition piece out of higher education.
Great, thank you. So it sounds as a panel that you feel that the pandemic has had a overall learning and awakening. It's been an overall learning and awakening event for this sort of arena, and that, you know, it's been beneficial because it's put sort of disability and mental health issues on the agenda, and that we would expect measurable progress, hopefully, going forward. So that's sort of, I think, a very positive outlook, and good to hear. Any reactions or comments to each other's notes or points? Anne-Marie.
Yes, I wasn't quite sure how best to intervene. I think, whilst I think there has been considerable progress and we've all outlined different areas, I think there is a real risk where some people will perhaps go back to thinking, okay, well, it's over now. That's it. We just go back to what we were doing. And I think that, there's a real pressure, demand, expectation on those of us who are championing this cause and this agenda to continue working with all those who are enthusiastic and supportive about it, to make sure that we don't slip back and that we don't just return to some of the ways that we were doing, but actually what we are now developing. And I think this may be slightly different for the Open University, that has a lot more and has a lot more expertise of working online. But for those of us who perhaps in universities where we may have had more in-person teaching, and obviously in this past year have been working fully online at certain points of the year, it's about how we move back to an effective, creative, blended approach that is taking the best of some of the inclusive, accessible online approaches and combining them with the in-person, so that collectively people are developing the sorts of skills, particularly that Victoria was mentioning, may well be required within certain workplaces, and certainly the placements.
That's a really important point. Anna-Lou, would you like to respond?
I agree with Anne-Marie. I think we have been really lucky at Dundee within my School of Science and Engineering, because the school has taken the decision to actually carry on in a blended mode and use the physical contact for active learning, but actually take the learning we've had about being more inclusive and enabling wider participation. So I'm hopeful that we can keep the good parts, but we need to be upfront and really push this with our higher up authorities as well.
So I think the takeaway message is that we have to make sure that the progress and awakening continues, and that we don't slip back, which I think is an excellent point. The second question for the panel is, what do you feel are the big challenges ahead to bring this improvement? So I'll start with Kate this time.
Thanks, Fari. Yeah, I think the big challenge now is to move away, or start to move away, from the kind of tinkering around the edges, kind of interventions-based, piloting, trying things kind of approach, particularly in mental well-being, but also in disability, which we've really been adopting for the last few years. Now that we've got an idea of what works, it's time to start embedding it in practice. in a real sustainable way. And by embedding it, I mean, it needs to be both situated and anchored within teaching and learning. So not something around the edges that students can engage with or not as they need. It needs to be ubiquitous across institutions so that students get a kind of seamless approach to it. And it needs to be ongoing. That's perhaps the most important thing. It needs to not rely on particular strategies or particular fundings or a particular person who might be driving improvement in one area. It needs to be something that's really, really embedded in practice.
Thanks. I'm sorry, sometimes the button seems to freeze. Anne-Marie.
I know what you mean about freezing buttons, Fari. I would agree with Kate in terms of the embedded nature and the moving from the margins to the centre. I think it's not only about embedding within the teaching and learning, but it's about thinking about how some of these things can be embedded within the programme design. So that actually the design of the student experience is thought about not just at a modular level, but actually at a programme level. And that we are thinking about ways in which our students are being encouraged to recognise the benefits for themselves. So, for instance, one thing we have at Lancaster is that we've got a short online course which is about creating accessible documents. This is something I'm often championing academic colleagues to do, to make sure their documents are accessible. But why not, and in fact I already do, actually encourage our students to do that? Because when they move into the workplace, this can also be something that they can be learning as part of a more holistic curriculum in which they're engaging. I could say more, but I shall pause there for the moment.
Thank you. Victoria.
Great, thanks, Barry. Again, agree with what's been said already. I think for me, I think it's definitely important to think about, not like we've touched on, not just automatically going back to how things were before, but committing to developing more of a blended approach to teaching. I think just because of the nature of the work that I do, those transition points for me are still kind of a big challenge for young people with disabilities or mental health. So thinking about, how can you better support your young people and students coming into the first year of study, with the transition potentially back to in-person teaching, where there may be changes in situations that are harder for some students to manage than others, and kind of making sure that we're committed to supporting those people effectively. I think making sure, which Kate touched on, that information is easily accessible across the full student body, so you don't have kind of pockets of excellence on some faculties or courses and way less progression on others. I think is a real challenge to make sure that's consistent, and that it's really kind of consulted and student led. I think something that comes across all the programs we run is how committed graduates and students are to kind of participating in designing their learning and their teaching, and making sure there is a place for that voice in that design is super important. And I think just an extra little point at the end around kind of the intersectionality of students and young people and the people that we support through our programme, and making sure that work on disability inclusion isn't siloed from all other areas of inclusion, which is we see a lot happen with some of our employer partners that we work with. So just thinking a bit more holistically about inclusion. I don't have an answer to how you do that across all different areas of work, but something that I think could be an interesting challenge moving forward.
Thank you, Victoria. And Anna-Lou.
This is one of my favorite areas. I have been championing for a long time that we embed not only accessibility in all our programs and modules, but in our training and teaching. So what I would like to see is that every undergraduate program embeds accessibility into its curriculum, We are very lucky we are now embedding this into second year teaching, second year medicine. All our competing students are required to think about accessibility from day one, so they don't get extra marks for thinking about accessibility. They get marks deducted if they don't take this into consideration. And until we start embedding this across the board in undergraduate teaching, we won't see it becoming part of the norm instead of, as Kate and Marie and Victoria say, as something extra.
Thank you. Those are really good observations. So it sounds like the panel agrees that really for serious improvement to occur, what we need to be doing is, to the words that were used, we're embedding, taking a holistic approach, threading it through everything so that it's not an add-on, it's not an extra on the fringe, but it's part of the mainstream of what we and all our students do. Any additional comments or thoughts from the panel? Kate.
Hi, yes. Actually, I wanted to take things a step further, if that's okay, and say that as well as embedding accessibility, inclusion and mental well-being across our teaching, our learning, our programs, as Anne-Marie was saying, it actually needs to be really across our entire institution and the whole student experience. So particularly across the administrative processes that we put students through, we need to be making sure that those are inclusive, that they're accessible, and that they support mental well-being, and across the other aspects of student life as well. So it really needs to be a completely holistic approach.
Thank you. Point well made. Anne-Marie.
Kate sort of picked a little part of what I was going to say about the whole approach for the student experience. I'd go even one step further and say that I think we need to make sure that it's actually embedded across our institutions. So not just our processes for our students, but actually our processes for our research and the way in which that's conducted. And also with the other stakeholders that universities inevitably engage in. The other point that I wanted to just quickly make was that I think in terms of the other consideration, I think, is certainly about becoming more aware about the type of support that our students, particularly for those universities that are working with students who are studying as well as living in other countries, and for whom the issue of disability and mental health may well be viewed quite differently in terms of those countries and the contexts in which they're working. Certainly some work that we're doing in terms of with postgraduate students who live and work in other countries is the encouragement of perhaps issues about disclosure, which generally have been increasing more recently, which has enabled some of these issues to be addressed. Of course, the need for disclosure is counter to inclusivity, but nevertheless, at the moment, that's still an important factor. But for those who are studying and living abroad in other countries, perhaps being more, for staff to be more aware of some of the cultural sensitivities around the whole agenda, particularly around mental health, and how that may restrict students from perhaps sharing things which then inhibit their engagement in the learning.
That's a really good point about cultural differences and sensitivities. So the third question is, where do you feel the sector will be by the time the 7th APS conference convenes in April 2023, so in 2 years? Let's start with Anne-Marie this time.
Sorry, I was just making a quick note. I think 2 years is a long time in some respects, but in another way, it's no time at all. So I can see that within the next year, I think one of the things I anticipate that we will perhaps be more aware of in 2 years' time is beginning to be more aware of the lessons that have been learnt that we've been able to sustain, and the areas where perhaps we have fallen back a bit and where we might be needing to regroup and re-energize ourselves in terms of moving forward. And then the other area I think that we may well be perhaps more aware and attuned of is the potential impact particularly in relation to mental health, and how that is impacting in the engagement of students, particularly in terms of some of their learning. Now, this may be more so for those students who are coming straight from school at 18, who haven't had the exam experiences, who are entering into universities and who are having to face and engage in exams and the natural anxiety that people might have, but for whom actually this is then exacerbated because of the experiences that they've had as a result of COVID. So I think those would be two of the things, and I'm looking forward to hearing what other colleagues say in response to that question.
Victoria.
Great. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think for me, this is the first time I've been to this conference, so it'd be actually really interesting to come back in a few years and see how conversations have developed. I really hope that it's still on the agenda, that there is still part of me that thinks that as soon as people go back to in-person teaching or back to work in person, that it's quite easy to forget all the lessons that we've learned over the past year. So I really hope it is kind of pushed forward and that momentum isn't lost. I think people do have a greater understanding from having to kind of work from home, teach from home, homeschool, of the kind of various different elements of people's life and how that impacts on their learning or their work. So I really hope that it does stay, and kind of people do have that increased levels of flexibility and thinking differently about how you can deliver high quality teaching and learning in a different and new world. I think again, because of my focus on kind of transition into employment, I think that there is still going to be kind of felt in the employment landscape for a long time the impact of the pandemic. I think, as Anne-Marie mentioned, the anxieties that particularly young people might have entering higher education who haven't done exams for the past 2 years, like you mentioned. And we've definitely seen in my work the anxiety for people leaving higher education at this time, where the job market's more competitive, there are fewer graduate schemes running, what employers are looking for in terms of skill sets has shifted slightly, a real focus on kind of tech companies, and fewer obviously on hospitality. So kind of that changing landscape, I think, is something to really bear in mind across higher education, which I think is a really interesting kind of challenge. But I hope for me that it like I say, it kind of those learnings continue to expand and it becomes and stays part of the agenda and that conversation around inclusivity, not just specifically disability and mental health. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it develops.
Anna-Lou?
Sorry, it takes a bit of time to negotiate my interface. Interesting question. Like Victoria, this is the first time I've been at this conference. I think that looking ahead in 2 years' time, it's so important to equip staff, particularly and teaching staff, with these skills they need to actually deliver better blended learning. So people are working at the OU are fantastic and have a real benefit from doing this day to day forever. But for universities who are not used to online learning, there needs to be a lot more upskilling of teaching staff and also professional staff to support better access. And I would love to see more of that in the next conference.
Thank you. Kate?
Thanks, Fari. Excuse me. Yeah, I have a wish list that I would love to see in 2 years' time at the next conference. It's got 3 things on it. So the first one, I would love to see some of these gaps reducing. You know, we have some huge outcome gaps for students with mental health issues in particular. We have outcome gaps for students with disabilities. There has been some amazing work, and some of those gaps are starting to reduce in some areas. But I think in the next conference in 2 years' time, I'd love to see some evidence of those reducing. Second thing on the wish list, I would love to see more diverse and more authentic voices in this space. I think it is increasing and we're doing better, but there is still a need to seek out the voices and the silences and any mediated voices as well, which are out there, you know. And as part of that, which links to the third thing on my wish list, is I would love to see more institutions learning from students and coming to the conference and saying, we did this because this is what the students said. You know, not because we thought it was a good idea or because it linked with our area of research, but this is what the students said, and so this is what we did. So those are my 3 things.
And Lou, you wanted to respond or comment further?
Yes, it's really to add on to what Kate said. We have seen so much increase in what I call high incidence disabilities in higher education and further education. But where are the people with more complex disabilities? They're not even getting into that space. And I've just been working with our admissions people to ensure that they actually give the chance to students who come in with very little academic background because of their disadvantages in terms of severe physical impairment. And I would love to see more of those students studying with us as well as with the OU. I know that the OU have far greater numbers of these students, but I would love to see more severe disability in our sector.
Thank you. And now, Anne-Marie, you have your hand up to comment.
Yes, it was just to build on what Anna Lou was saying, and just to sort of agree with her about the particular challenges, some work that we were involved in with the Institute for Employment Studies, where we did a piece of work for HEFCE on students with mental health difficulties and those with complex disabilities. And I think one of the challenges around those with complex disabilities was often it was the sequence of events whereby students would be applying for university, and then the exchange and the information, and in fact the same was sometimes true for students with mental health difficulties, of the complexity of the relationships that universities have then with the health service and social care, so that it was in enabling students who might want to go and study in another part of the country or not necessarily from home to be able to access the education and course that they wanted, but also for the wraparound package of support that would enable them to be able to operate as effective students when they were there. So I think just to sort of flag up that was an area of concern, and I think there are some challenges that still need addressing with respect to that particular issue.
Thank you. A lot of interesting thoughts and responses going in the chat as well. So our final question for today, are there any other key points you would encourage our audience of delegates to consider going forward? So I'll start with Victoria.
Great, thank you. I think for me, we've touched on kind of lots of the different things that I think I would mention that are super important. I think, like I've mentioned earlier, not kind of rushing back to how things were before, but really trying to embed the learning and think about how you can make the courses, universities as a whole inclusive as possible. And I think Kate's point and Anne-Marie's around across, organisation, kind of institution wide is super key. So not just your teaching and learning, but how do you, access your kind of pastoral support? How do you go through your administrative processes? How are you accessing kind of all of the other elements of the student experience, and how inclusive is that? I think one thing that we've seen through the group of graduates that we work with through Change 100, which is the internship scheme that I manage, is that candidates are increasingly savvy, looking for employers who are very inclusive, that talk about what they're doing around disability and mental health, that have kind of public commitments to that. And I think that does feed down to the work that I do with colleges and secondary schools as well, where particularly the young people that I support are looking for universities and higher education institutions that are inclusive, that are doing great stuff, that are forward thinking. So a point, I think, just to think about how that is being communicated to potential applicants and candidates for your courses. So thinking about how are you articulating the great stuff you're doing to potential students as well.
Thanks, Victoria. Anna-Lou?
I'd just like to say that I am so excited by the fact that, like Kate said, accessibility, disability is finally in the mainstream chat. And I think we as a group of knowledgeable people need to actually support that in the ongoing, so that we actually make the best use of COVID, and that we won't be going back to normal. Normal will be different, and how can we actually use the best we've learned throughout the COVID scenarios?
Thank you. Kate?
Thanks, Fari. Yes, first of all, to say I completely agree with Anna-Lou, as you'd imagine. But there were two key things I wanted to just share with everybody for going forward. First, to make sure that inclusion, accessibility and wellbeing is embedded at the design stage of everything that you do. Make sure that you're getting somebody on board, that you're asking the right questions, and making sure that accessibility and inclusion is just considered in those very, very early stages, because trying to retrofit it is an absolute nightmare, as we all know. And the second thing I wanted to share was just at the same time, still as part of that design stage, make sure you're planning your evaluation. How are you going to measure how inclusive, how accessible it is going forward? How are you going to identify what changes need to be made going forward? That's everything from me. Thanks, Barry.
Excellent points. And Anne-Marie?
Yes, I would agree. They are excellent points that colleagues have raised. I think for me, I was particularly struck by Anna-Lou's earlier comment about the embedding of the accessibility into the actual teaching and learning of the course, and how that then became part of the assessment. So I'm certainly going to be taking that away with me, Anna-Lou, in a much more direct way than I have perhaps thought about before. But I think the area of the way, so thinking about how we're designing our curriculum inclusively, for me, adopting some of the inclusive design principles of including collaboration. So the collaboration with the students, but also with the employers, which would touch upon Victoria's client base in a sense, so that our curriculum is being developed inclusively to respond to those different voices. And then I suppose the overriding issue, which is that each disabled person will themselves bring a number of other factors into the learning experience. And I think it's the importance, as we're designing and thinking about these things, about the importance of the intersectionality, whether it be a student's age, whether it be whether they have caring responsibilities, whether it's race, whether it's age, whether it's a particular educational learning experience. So I think it's recognizing those things alongside their disability, so that may well be thinking about what we can do as we're designing our curriculum, and of course the ongoing embedded nature of evaluation and reflection by the staff who are designing and developing these things. Final plug, I think, for all institutions is to be thinking about how they are supporting their staff with their ongoing professional development in this, what for some is a very new area, and which we need to continue to support and encourage the small steps that they're taking so that they can feel more confident in embedding some of this in the future.